All right, welcome back, everyone. Good afternoon. For this session, we have 3 papers, and then a response, and then time for questions. So again, please hold your questions until that time, and if you could please silence your cell phones, that would be great. Our next speaker is Jordan Troeller, recently appointed lecturer at the Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin and at the Freie Universität Berlin. Her research focuses on Bauhaus and its diaspora, and her talk today is the first to bring us to the United States, as it considers the influence of Bauhaus pedagogy through the work of Ruth Asawa. Her paper is titled Ruth Asawa on Paper, Two-Dimensional Work of a Sculptor. Please welcome Jordan Troeller.
Thank you so much, Laura. I just wanted to echo the round of thank yous to Laura, of course, and Melissa and Bridget. Thank you so much, and to the staff of the Harvard Art Museums. In 1949, the Busch Reisinger, then still called the Germanic Museum, received a gift of over 600 objects. The donor was Josef Albers, the Bauhaus-trained Rhineland-born artist who had emigrated to the US in 1933 and was teaching at Black Mountain College. In addition to photographs taken by Albers himself of his own work and that of others, as well as graphic designs by his former Bauhaus colleague and fellow German émigré Herbert Bayer, a good portion of the gift encompassed work by his Black Mountain students. That is to say, work by American artists of a younger generation, which significantly expanded the parameters of the museum's collection with its focus on the art of Germany and Northern Europe. Among these student works were 13 by the Japanese-American artist Ruth Asawa. Although best known today as a sculptor, Asawa left behind a large body of work on paper, not only intricate line drawings, monoprints, and lithographs, but also collages, many of which she made at Black Mountain. She first heard of the school in the early 1940s, while a student at the Milwaukee State Teachers College, where she was told that because of her ethnicity, she would have no chance of finding a teaching position. And while in high school, Asawa, along with her family, when Asawa was still in high school, was actually interned in a camp. Fellow students in Milwaukee who had been to the small liberal arts school in North Carolina, including Elaine Schmidt-Urban and Ray Johnson, encouraged her to apply. During the college's summer session of 1946, the 20-year-old Asawa took 2 courses, both with Albers, design and color. This work that you see here was completed in the design course, which employed a monochromatic palette in order to isolate and explore specific quote-unquote problems, as Asawa later put it, to which students would find solutions, quote-unquote. Here, how to render concentric circles without drawing a single circle, instead delineating the negative space of encompassing squares in which these circles are nestled, such that circle and square are equally important visually, and it's really the way that these two forms are distinct, but at the same time dependent on one another, that likely caught Albers' attention as her teacher. A hallmark of his pedagogy was that he asked students to set aside notions of expression, abstract expressionism, then the dominant paradigm in the US, and go back to the thing itself. Quote, train the pencil to do what your eye sees, he implored. Don't worry about self-expression. That will take care of itself. Style will follow. What I want to find out now is if your hand is capable of following your eye, if you can draw, unquote. He encouraged students to shake themselves of habits that impeded this correspondence between eye and hand, having them cover a sheet of paper with vertical straight lines drawn, quote unquote, visually, as Asawa put it, meaning without a ruler. First going from the left side of the paper to the right, and then from the right to the left. Students also drew the same object from multiple angles, exploring its shifting proportions as it rotated in space. And this is Asawa's own left hand, she was right-handed, arched, gripped, opened, angled backward, clenched in a fist, thumb to forefinger. And she also used both sides of the sheet in certain areas. Here, it looks like as though this is her right hand, and up here, but this is really on the other side of the sheet, and it's a transparent piece of paper. These 13 sheets in Harvard, all completed between 1946 and 1949, the year that Asawa left Black Mountain for San Francisco, remained in Albers' possession, and this was a habit of his, to keep student work that he felt exemplified his pedagogy. Quote, things that explained what he was trying to do, unquote, as Asawa described the donation years later. Albers also photographed exercises he especially liked, a practice that he had already begun in the 1920s in his preliminary course at the Bauhaus. The student exercises were for him serial iterations of essential visual problems, and in fact, repetition was foundational to his pedagogy. Regardless of their level, students took the same courses, so that advanced students studied alongside new students. As Asawa recalled, quote, basically classes were identical, so that you didn't go to an advanced class. You took basic design every semester, but you didn't advance from, paper, unquote. Her interviewer then asked, you're saying that when students took basic design, that students took basic design over again? Asawa, over again, over and over again. And then what you did was if you took paper folding, then you take it to another level. So that you didn't advance from paper to plastic, you advanced from paper. And then what paper could do, more and more and more of what paper could do. That's how he taught, unquote. The basic in the title of his course was not meant in the sense of beginning, but in the sense of foundational. The structural principles necessary, he thought, for any further thinking on visual experience. Many of these 13 sheets are what Albers called free studies. These were exercises that encouraged students to complicate things. They were always done outside of class, on the student's own time, and then discussed as a group, and maybe even the first group crit as we know it today. In this photograph, you can see Asawa, here, this is Ray Johnson. This is her future husband, Albert Lanier. This is Sil Silman, who also, there's 4 works by him that are also included in the 49 gift. Asawa's contribution is on the floor in the center, notably upside down in relation to the orientation given by her signature, which was likely added later. The study employs one of Albers' favored pedagogical motifs, the Greek meander. Quote, he would make us do the meander many, many times, Asawa recalled. What you have to do is plan in your head or in your eye before you get inside there so that you can come out, so that the spaces will be equal. And what she means by getting in there is perhaps better explained by this sheet of class notes, where she diagrams at the bottom what she later describes how one goes down 4 units. I'm paraphrasing her. You can see the numbers next to these. Over 4, up 3, over 2, etc. So it's an exercise in measuring with your eyes how to get out of a meander and have the negative meander and the positive meander be equal. These so-called free studies, and here's another example that Albers found particularly good, would add further visual problems, here not just covering a page with a formal motif, but then pushing that form so that it sometimes operates as background and sometimes as foreground. Albers especially liked exercises that put figure and ground in motion so that, quote, it would go back and forth, as Asawa put it. The black would become the background, and then the white would become the background, unquote. This flip-flopping generated what he saw as a third element, one that didn't exist prior to the act of visual perception. And it was in this seeing that activated the picture, so to speak, he thought. And here's another example of that, where Asawa's choice of contrasting colors, this blue and reddish orange, which you can see upstairs, and the photograph makes it look a lot more orange, but really it's quite difficult to sometimes perceive the difference between the red bulbous shapes and the orange ones. These generate the perception of the removal of material, that as if these shapes were cut out of the blue, when in fact, and that's also why I'm adding the photo of it in raking light, the opposite is true. She's added these elements on top. But the point here is exactly that pressure put on material truth, that visual perception takes on a reality as effective as these tactile elements. It's no secret that Asawa was one of Albers' favored students, pretty much from the start, evidenced in his class assessments and recommendation letters. The two later exchanged work, with Albers even surreptitiously circumventing his dealer Sidney Janus in order to give Asawa a big discount on one of his paintings. For her part, Asawa defended the German artist publicly. In a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle in response to a review of an Albers exhibition, Asawa wrote, quote, When Baker, the author of the review, tells us that one homage to the square painting would sufficiently represent Albers, he is missing the point entirely. Albers believed that the possibilities for color and spatial combinations were endless. His experiments with light and color have affected generations of artists all over the world, and indeed Albers told his students that his chief mission was to open eyes. To reduce the work of Joseph Albers to that of great teacher and practitioner is to close one's eyes to his greatest gift, that of an artist, unquote. Here are two more examples. On the left, how color behaves depending on its juxtaposition with other colors. And on the right, the placement of darker brown cutouts producing the illusion of spatial dimension, as if these were shadows cast by the bulbous forms instead of superimposed flat surfaces. In another public defense of Albers, this time a letter to New York Times critic Roberta Smith in 1998, nearly 50 years after she had left Black Mountain College, Asawa criticized Smith's discussion of his paintings as, quote, the workmanlike purity of their clearly handmade surfaces with hues that suggest distilled times of day, unquote, and just as she likened Albers to Arthur Dove and Georgia O'Keeffe. Disputing this, Asawa pointed out that Albers taught a way to look, and she proceeded to tell Smith, quote, how to look at an Albers painting, unquote, to focus her eyes on the edge where the squares meet, and then to use peripheral vision. And she spells it all out for Roberta Smith. The colors then exchange places in the mind's eye. Or as Asawa put it later in a lecture on Albers at the San Francisco Museum of Art, quote, my aim, he told us, is to make you see more than you want to, unquote. It's this tipping over of the two-dimensional into the three-dimensional that makes these works on paper particularly interesting as the prehistory of someone who became known for her sculptures. Albers taught us, Asawa later said, quote, how to explore a material beyond its traditional use. And another sheet that's in the Harvard's collection was made as part of her work duties in the laundry room at Black Mountain College. The stamp BMC, which marked the bed sheets as property of the college, marches across the sheet in vertical rows, sometimes straight, sometimes at an angle, but always traveling from one edge to its opposite. And it's possible even that Asawa rotated the sheet in order to more easily carry this out, further approaching the page not as a surface, but as a procedural object. The multiplication of the three-letter stamp has the effect of subordinating legibility to visual pattern. The letter C, for example, long stops referring to college and builds a linked chain of doubled open circles. Or the way in which, for example, we read these irregular gaps of unstamped areas where the newspaper is visible as figural elements extending off of the printed page of both news sheet and inked sheet. This rendering of language nonsensical is a way to push the limits of two-dimensionality, shares with the stamp drawings of Leger and others decades earlier, as Maria Goff here has recently argued with reference to a very similar sheet by Asawa that's also in the Harvard collection and currently on view. Asawa's use of the housing classifieds in that work, as well as the fact that she's chosen the materials of the laundry room, also points to the role of domesticity in her brand of mid-century modernism, which would later draw on her own San Francisco home in ways that coded her labor as that of mother and housewife as well as artist. And it's interesting, Asawa would have 6 kids during the 1950s, a decade that was also one of her most generative artistically. If Albers originally donated these works to the museum as demonstration pieces of his pedagogy, we see today that they are significant in an entirely different way, showing how that pedagogy was taken up by a sculptor and made into something else entirely. This was also, though, important to Albers, an artist who hated imitators. Another of his students, Mary Gregory, remembers him saying, "To follow me, follow yourself." Asawa did that, I'd suggest, primarily through her redefinition of line, transforming line into a unit with its own weight and structure. And in the 1950s, for example, she began a series of works that she called marker drawings. In all of these, she used a Flowmaster pen intended for commercial signage, like the week's special in the grocery store. This pen furnished especially opaque ink and had a broad tip that allowed for lettering to be seen at a distance. Asawa actually cut grooves into this tip, transforming it into a stamp that left behind 6 straight lines in this case. This allowed her to vary the length of the line while maintaining a regular structure within that line, 6 equally spaced marks. She could then depict aspects of her subject, like the brittle leaves of grass, simply by varying the pressure of pen on paper, in this case pausing at regular intervals to deposit more ink onto the page in an effect that generates the papery quality of the plant's cellulose fibers. Or in another example, using the same 6-grooved tip, she slightly curved her gesture so that the same line creates the undulating waves the undulating surfaces of waves or clouds. In a letter to Albers in 1963, she tells him of a new series of sculptures that she's working on, her so-called tied wire sculptures. Quote, "It's very exciting, for example. I have 1,000 strands of wire in a bundle. I divide them into 3 bunches of 333 strands. And then each bunch is divided again and again and again until 2 strands are left. And I tie each joint with the same wire so that there's no solder used. My tool is a pair of pliers that will cut and twist the wire. The variations are endless," unquote. And rather than showing you the sculpture, I'm showing you the drawing that she made of one of these sculptures. And this was something that she often did, drawing her own sculptures once they were completed, rather than drawing as a preparatory sketch. What's more is that the tied wire sculptures, interestingly enough, came about because she tried to draw a plant and wasn't able to. But she knew that if she could make a sculpture of it, she'd then be able to draw it. Sculpture for her became a way to draw, and drawing a way to process and renew her sculptural practice. These 13 sheets, in other words, do much more than exemplify Albers' pedagogy. Not only do they show us how Asawa made that pedagogy her own, transforming it into a sculptural language that moved between 2 and 3 dimensions, they also point to the role of teaching in Asawa's own artwork. In the late 1960s, she established the first public arts programs in the San Francisco School District, in which children used readily available materials like milk cartons and egg crates to explore geometry and mass. A dialogue with children that had already begun in her own home as she worked alongside them at the kitchen table or on the living room floor. She later commented that although her Black Mountain studies were important, it wasn't the exercises themselves, but rather the way those engagements with form generated an unorthodox approach to materials, audiences, and communities of cultural production. Quote, "And so I have a tendency to explore one material and try to find as many ways as I can use it without destroying its property, and then finding a new face to it," she explained. I think that was Albers' value. Not the color studies, not the drawing, not all of that, but he taught us how to see things, or rather how to look at things, how to find things. That's as important as the lessons of color or basic design, to find something right in front of you and then redefine it. Thank you.